So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is David Lesher. I'm the Government Affairs Director at PPIC, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. We are a nonpartisan, independent research institute or think tank. We're based in San Francisco, but we have offices here in Sacramento, and we do research on most of the issues that cross the plate here in Sacramento. Obviously, a lot of work on education that we'll hear more about today. So a couple of quick announcements before we get to the presentation. I wanted to say thank you to the James Irvine Foundation. This event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series that we're conducting throughout the year on a number of different topics. And also a thank you to the Bren Foundation for their contribution to this particular study we're going to hear about today. Also, on your chairs, you should have a copy of the report that we're going to talk about today. And on our website, which is just ppic.org, you can find the slides that will be used in today's presentation as well. And there's also a little salmon-colored sheet, or it actually looks like a little yellow-colored sheet this time, that's an evaluation of today's event. And if you wanted to fill it out at the end and drop it off on the table as you leave, that'd be very much appreciated. A couple of quick announcements about some other upcoming events we're hosting. On May 7th, the week after next, this event is in San Francisco, but it'll be live streamed on our website. It's a conversation with Mark Udoff, the president of the University of California, and you know, what's happening in the UC system as well as in higher education in general. And on May 10th, a little later that week, at the Sheraton here in Sacramento, we're hosting a half-day conference on water. And especially some of the science and management issues in the Delta ecosystem. So that is going to be it's a very good event. There's some very a good couple of panels there on that topic. So I also might, if you want to avoid an embarrassing moment, you might silence your cell phones. This is being taped for broadcast, so I wanted to make that announcement. And then I'll introduce our presenter today. Julian Betts is a Bren Fellow at PPIC, and he is also an economics professor at UC San Diego. And he has done a number of reports at PPIC and elsewhere over the last couple of years about a range of issues in the K-12 system. So with that, I'll let him come up and present our report today. Please welcome Julian Betts.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. This is a report that was released today and is co-authored with Andrew Zau and Karen Volz from UCSD. I've asked them both to stand. This report could you stand up for a second so they know who you are? Andrew is a senior statistician at the San Diego Education Research Alliance, and Karen is the director of San Diego Education Research Alliance, or Sandera. And this report would not have been possible without them, so thank you. And we'll have them up afterwards to help answer all your most difficult questions. This is a paper which we just produced, which is looking at a huge increase in the graduation requirement in San Diego Unified School District, which is the second largest district in California. And we think it has implications for a number of other large districts around the state, which are doing something similar. So let me just start by talking about the concept of college readiness. And I guess I need to get rid of this. College readiness is a term that's been bandied about for many years. It's been brought again to the fore by President Obama, who has said that every high school in the United States should adopt dual goals of making sure that every graduate is prepared for college and career. So I'm going to be focusing today mostly on the college preparedness side of things. And in California, as you know, when we talk about college preparedness or readiness, we're mostly talking about the so-called A to G course requirements. These are high school courses that students need to complete to be even eligible to attend Cal State or the University of California. Something that has sort of added on top of President Obama's national call is something that the ACLU has been doing in California. The ACLU has been arguing that students in many schools have not had adequate access to the full complement of A to G subjects, and has been lobbying major school districts to in fact adopt the A to G course requirements as a high school graduation requirement. I think the underlying thinking here is that you can level the playing field by exposing every student to college prep work. Of course, not all of them will go to college, but you at least give people, when they're young, the option to go on to college and expose them to that material. So several large districts in California have adopted this. The first was San Jose Unified, which did this with much fanfare in 2002. There's a slate of new major districts, really large districts, that have done this. San Francisco Unified has adopted the A to G requirements, and the class of 2014 will be the first class subject to this requirement. So students who are in grade 11 right now, today. Oakland Unified is a year behind the class of 2015. Will need to complete A to G in order to receive a high school diploma. And LA Unified and San Diego Unified are on exactly the same timetable. They've adopted this standard for the class of 2016. So students who are in grade 9 now, by 2016, will need to have completed the A to G requirements to get a high school diploma through the regular route. For those of you who aren't familiar with the A to G requirements, they're up here on this slide. You can think of it as 15 year-long courses, or we prefer to think of it as 30 semester-long courses in 7 subject areas: history and social studies, English language arts, math, lab science, world languages, visual and performing arts, and 2 semesters of electives are the requirement. And to be eligible to attend either University of California or Cal State, it's not enough simply to take these courses and pass them. Every course must be passed with a grade of C or higher. So that's a fairly daunting set of courses for many students in California. If we look statewide at A to G completion rates, only about 40% of high school graduates in the state of California in a typical year recently have completed the A to G course sequence. We've seen a steady rise in that. Compared to President Obama's vision of everybody being prepared for college, that's obviously a very low number. But seen in a different perspective, that's not an astonishingly low number at all. The master plan of 1960 essentially states the top third of high school graduates should be attending either Cal State or the University of California. See, in that light, 40% isn't necessarily a low number. But it does raise really important issues about access for certain students. So the districts I've talked about, with one important exception, have adopted the A to G requirement with a very important twist. Instead of the UC Cal State requirement that every single course has to be completed with a grade of C or higher, these districts have said grades of D or higher will be satisfactory. The exception to this is Los Angeles Unified. The class of 2016, just like in San Diego, will need to get Ds or higher to get a high school diploma. But starting with the class of 2017, so these are students who are currently in grade 8 in Los Angeles, those students will need to complete all 30 semester courses with grades of C or higher. And we think that has very, very important implications for the students in Los Angeles, because the results I'm about to show you are for San Diego, but San Diego bears some very strong resemblances to Los Angeles in terms of initial student preparation. So bear that in mind as I show you the results. So what exactly did we do in our study? We looked back in time instead of forward in time. We took a recent graduating class, the class of 2011, and Andy went through and counted every single course that a student had taken from middle school through the end of grade 12, looked at whether they were A to G courses or not, and also looked at the grades recorded. And from this worked out the percentage of students who completed the A to G requirements overall, as well as the A to G requirements in each of the subjects: math, history, social science, and so on. So the idea here is that we're probably setting a lower bound on what is actually going to happen to the class of 2016. No student in the class of 2011 was required to take A to G courses, but what we're doing, I think, is providing a useful sort of guide to how much the average student in the district is going to need to improve to meet this new graduation requirement. So here are the main results. In the class of 2011, 61% of students would have met the new requirement of completing all 30 of these courses with grades of D or higher. If you instead had said, well, maybe San Diego should have been a bit tougher and had exactly the same standards as Cal State and the University of California and required grades of C or higher, that makes a huge difference. As you can see in the first bullet, only 42% of graduates in the class of 2011 actually completed A to G with grades of C or higher. So that gap, 20%, is telling you that 20% of students in the district completed all the A to G courses, but received a D in at least one of those courses. Another thing we looked at was access. So one very indirect way of gauging that is to ask how many students actually took enough courses in the A to G sequence. So if they had high enough grades, they would have satisfied the requirement. Well, that number is 68%. So just over 2/3 of students were actually taking all the courses needed. Only 61% were passing all of them with grades of D or higher, and a far smaller number, about 42% were completing with grades of C or higher. Now here I have to be very careful because these numbers I think are the most relevant ones, but notice that we're focusing here on students who already graduated from high school in the class of 2011. What if we looked at everybody who starts 3 years earlier in grade 9 and follow those students over time? We threw out students who left for other districts because we had no idea whether they did complete the A to G requirements, but we included students who ultimately dropped out. We also included a substantial number of students who were still enrolled in the district in June 2011, but who had not yet completed enough credits to graduate. When we look at this much larger sample, we find that only 40% of students in the class of 2011 had completed the A to G requirements with grades of D or higher. So this is going to be a challenge for the district because essentially they have from today about 3 years to get the class of 2016 ready for this much more demanding set of courses. We wanted to look for variation across student subgroups, so one thing that we looked at was race and ethnicity. And what you'll see in this graph is the sort of greenish-blue bars is showing by racial ethnic group the percentage of students completing A to G with grades of C or higher. The middle bars, the orange bars, are showing the same, but the percentage of students who completed A to G with grades of D or higher. And as you can see, those bars are substantially higher. And then we also wanted to look at how many students actually attempted the full complement of 30 semester-long courses, and that number is higher still. So when you look at variations, what you see is that African Americans, and in particular Hispanics, lag behind both Asians and whites. There are also some pretty pronounced gaps within race or ethnicity between the C, D, and attempted bars. So to me, I think the most dramatic results are for Hispanics. You see here that about a quarter of Hispanics completed the A to G requirements with grades of C or higher. Far more than that, about half completed with D or higher. So this is suggesting that many Hispanic students are taking all the courses but are getting Ds in one or more courses. And also this is the group for which there's the biggest gap between number of courses completing the course requirements with D and attempting all the courses but failing some. There's about a 10 percentage point gap there for Hispanics. So we see pretty big variations by race and ethnicity. If you look in the report in front of you, you'll also see big variations with respect to parental education. It turns out there's not much of a distinction between students whose parents were high school dropouts versus high school graduates, but a big difference between those two groups and students whose parents had some college or a college degree or higher. We looked at some other variations as well. In San Diego, in a typical year, just under 1/3 of students are English learners. And sure enough, being an English learner is a really big issue. If a student in the class of 2011, according to our records, had ever been designated an English learner, then 49% of them had graduated with Ds or higher in all of the A to G courses. That compares to 67% for graduates who had never been designated as English learners. Then we broke up that group of students who had ever been designated as English learners into those who are currently EL. And what that means is students who, at the end of grade 12, were still designated as English learners, and students who've been redesignated. So RFEP stands for redesignated or reclassified as fluent English proficient. These are students who were English learners, whose English skills improved dramatically and passed through various hurdles so that they were redesignated. And as you'd expect, the redesignated or reclassified students do pretty well, but they still lag behind the students who were never English learners. So about 58% of redesignated students complete the requirements with Ds or higher, compared to 67% of students who were never English learners. Probably the largest gap we found between any two groups was the gap between students who were still English learners and those who had never been English learners. You see here a gap of 35% completion for the grade 12 students who were still English learners, compared to 67%, about twice as high a level, for students who'd never been English learners. We also looked at students in special education, and there's a gap there of about 20 percentage points, as you can see. And there's a gap between males and females, which is, I think to some people, surprisingly large. Males complete the A to G requirements at about a 7% lower rate than do females. This is a San Diego pattern that is mirrored in statewide data. And this has been persistent over at least a decade. So it's quite alarming. In this column here, we're showing the results for C or higher. And we did that not because San Diego is requiring this, but because the ultimate goal here is to expose all students to A to G courses with the hope that many of them will actually complete all of these courses with grades of C or higher, be eligible to attend Cal State or UC, and maybe go to college when otherwise they wouldn't have even thought about doing it. And you see here pretty big gaps as well. So I'll just focus on one. Grade 12 students who are currently English learners, only 20% completed A to G with grades of C or higher, compared to about 49% of those who had never been English learners. So that's a very big gap indeed, and shows that certain demographic groups in the district really have a long way to go. Now, we wanted to put all these variables together. I've shown you essentially crosstabs, one variable at a time. We wanted to know, for instance, whether that big Hispanic white gap was due to the fact that many Hispanic students in the district are English learners. And can the special education student result be explained solely by grades and test scores? So we ran what is known as a Probit Model to try to predict passage of the A to G requirements with grades of D or higher based on student characteristics way back in grade 6. And this very complicated table here shows you the results of that. So each bar is either negative or positive. So bars that move to the left here are in negative territory, and bars like this over here are in positive territory, suggesting that these variables are associated with positive effects. We've got green bars for the model of passage with grades of C or higher, and the orange bars are showing the model where we were trying to predict whether students would complete the A to G requirements with grades of D or higher. One other thing to really notice about this is that some of these bars have asterisks on them and others don't. Those asterisks are indicating statistically significant differences between the given group and the comparison group. The comparison group here is a white male student who's not an English learner and not in special education. The first thing that to us, I think, really sort of stood out is that with one exception, the race and ethnicity variables are not statistically significant. And what that means is that the variations that we saw in that bar graph a few slides ago can be explained by things like differences in grade 6 GPA, differences in performance on the CST, the state test, and so on. The exception is Hispanic students, where even after controlling for other things, Hispanic students were predicted to be about 12% less likely to complete the A to G requirements. And that's after taking into account things that did matter, such as being an English learner. So here this bar is saying that if you're an English learner, you're about 4% less likely to complete A to G compared to otherwise similar students. For all the other groups, African American students, Asian students, and a very small other race group, there are really no statistically significant differences between them and whites. And what that means is that the other variables in the model account for those differences. So what other variables really matter a lot? I've already shown you the female result, that females are much more likely to complete A to G, and that stands up, even after taking into account the differences in grade 6 between GPA of girls and boys, differences in test scores of girls and boys. There's still something beyond that. There's the English learner result that's significant. Fluent English proficient students do a little bit worse on completion of A to G, but that's not statistically meaningful. So that means that being fluent English proficient in San Diego is something to actually feel a sense of accomplishment about. Special education students fare significantly worse. They're about 7 or 8% less likely to complete the A to G requirements with grades of D or higher. Percentage of days absent is highly statistically significant. And those are little tiny bars, but be careful. What we're showing there is the effect of being absent for 1% of days. There are students in the district who are absent 5 or 10% of days, so multiply that bar by 5 or 10, and you get a pretty significant negative effect. Probably the variable that matters more than anything else, and you can see this clearly here, is average grade point average. So if your annual GPA is 3 versus a 2, in other words, grades of B versus C, there's a huge predicted effect, almost a 15% gain in your predicted chance of completing A to G. And that is telling you that grades, even as early as grade 6, are really should be telling parents a lot about how their students are faring and what sort of trajectory they are on. Test scores matter as well. On the California Standards Test, the CST, the best predictor actually is the grade 6 math score. What we're showing here is the effect of a 1 standard deviation increase in the math test score. ELA, that stands for English Language Arts, that ELA score matters as well, because you can see is a smaller effect. And then in California, we test students in science, but only in certain grades. So we included grade 5 science scores as well. They work in the right direction, but they're not quite statistically significant. So there are a lot of things here that we can use to forecast how well students are going to do in the A to G overall. We also looked at variations not just across students, but across schools. And in this graph, what we're showing is the percentage of students in a school who complete the A to G requirements graphed against the percentage of students at the school who are deemed eligible for federal meal assistance. And what you see here is a very strong negative pattern. So schools that are enrolling less affluent populations have much lower completion rates, as you'd expect. There are a number of schools here that have 100% eligibility. These are schools that qualify for Provision 2 under the federal statute, which basically gives schools above 80%, with above 80% eligibility, a 4-year hiatus, where they don't need to gather this data every single year. And the federal government essentially assumes that 100% of students at the school are eligible. There's a lot of variation there, and there's one school, which is an international baccalaureate school, which does very well. But on average, these schools do fairly poorly, and there's a very strong negative relationship overall between essentially neighborhood affluence and completion rates on these A to G requirements. So far, we've been focusing just on one very simple concept. Does a student complete A to G or not? We've shown you that about 39% of students don't complete A to G with grades of D or higher. The next question, I think in a way the more important question, is, okay, of those 39% of students who didn't complete, how far short of completion are they? Is it just a course or 2, or is it 4 courses? So that's the next thing that we set out to look at. Among the graduates who did not complete, the median graduate was 2 to 3 semester courses short, which is not a big deal if you think of it in this way. The typical student is taking about 6 courses per semester. So you might think, maybe the student could complete this in his or her final year, which might be right. But we need to be careful here, because some students who are 2 or 3 courses short are 2 to 3 courses short in exactly the same subject area. So you can't take Spanish 1 and 2 at the same time. Most of these courses you need to take as part of a sequence. So for some students, the implication is that if they're going to pass this A to G requirement in the class of 2016, they're going to need to start taking courses not just in grade 12, but earlier in order to get through this hoop. One way we thought of characterizing this is that we're at about a 60% completion rate now. We could get that completion rate in San Diego up to about 80% by getting students to take 2 or 3 more A to G courses. And I think that's actually quite feasible. The students we're really worried about are the students who are more than 3 semester courses behind, because that for them might mean more than a year of study, especially if they're 4 or 5 courses behind or more in exactly the same subject area. So about a third of students were in sort of an intermediate zone where they were 1 to 6 semester courses short. That's probably something in theory you could tackle by working a little bit more diligently and taking a slightly richer set of courses in grades 11 and 12. The very bottom end, 3% of students were more than 6 semester courses short, and typically those are courses in the same subject, so they're students who could be in really big trouble. The next thing we did was to look at the number of courses short of completing the A to G requirement. So of the 39% of students who didn't complete the A to G requirement, we counted how many courses students were short in the social studies requirement, in the English requirement, and so on. And so you might want to look at this column on the right first. This is showing you for each subject the percentage of students who are at least one course short. When you look at that, what really stands out is that English language arts, mathematics, and foreign language or world language, however you want to call it, those are the three areas that seem to be causing the most trouble. English and math stand out in another way, and that is that there are significant numbers of students who are more than one or two courses short. There's a huge right tail in this table. There's some students who are 5 or more courses short in English, 5 or more courses short in math. These are students who are going to have extraordinary difficulty completing the A to G requirements under the new system, because what we're talking about here is students who basically were taking the wrong courses from probably grade 9 forward, and they're really going to have to work very hard to do that. We also have access to data that allows us to follow students from the graduating class into university through something called the National Student Clearinghouse, which has records for post-secondary records for universities that account for something like 93% of all post-secondary enrollments nationwide. So we're able to track all the students from the class of 2011 and see whether in 2011 to 12 they enrolled in post-secondary. 32% of graduates in the class of 2011 enrolled in a 4-year institution immediately after graduating. And of that 32%, about 2/3 went to UC and Cal State. So UC and Cal State really are the main providers of post-secondary education at the 4-year level for these students. But let's not forget about the 1/3 who went to universities other than UC and CSU. We think that an important policy issue here is that under the new standard, it's conceivable that a student wouldn't graduate under the new standard because they didn't complete all the A to G courses. And because of that, they're not going to get a diploma, and they're not going to get into an out-of-state university. So that's something that students in the class of 2016 need to be keenly aware of. We also looked at sort of an interesting question, sort of the flip side to that question. We looked at students who didn't complete the A to G requirements with grades of C or higher. 12% of those actually did go to college anyway. And most fascinating of all, about 7% of students who didn't complete the A to G requirements, according to our records, enrolled at the University of California or Cal State. Most of these students, in fact, enrolled at San Diego State. Now, how could it be that you could get into either of those institutions, UC or Cal State, without completing the A to G requirements? We think it's a mix of two things. District officials are quite certain that some universities have provided waivers to students who are right on the cusp of completing A to G, in particular some Cal State campuses. Another thing we think is going on is that a very small percentage of students are taking high school courses through community colleges. That does not show up in the transcripts. So when we say that 40% of students met the A to G requirement with grades of C or higher, it might be a little bit higher than that. It might be more like 42, 43%, because there's some students who are taking community college courses that San Diego Unified itself has no record of. But we think these results are very interesting because they suggest that most graduates, if they do go on to 4 years, they do go to UC and CSU. So the A to G requirements are quite relevant, but at the same time, there's some who go out of state. And we need to be very careful to make sure that they're not denied that a few years from now because they're a couple of courses short on A to G. If they go out of state, they won't be able to enroll because they won't have a high school diploma. The next thing I want to talk about is going to shift gears a little bit. We really want to be able to help San Diego Unified and other districts around the state that have either implemented or are contemplating implementing an A to G graduation requirement to isolate and pinpoint students who are probably going to face difficulties. And the A to G OnTrack model, we hope, will do exactly that. So first, let me just provide some motivation here. It seems clear that when you have about 40% of your students in a recent graduating class not meeting the new graduation requirement, you really need to identify students who are going to struggle with that requirement as early as possible and intervene with supports and remediation. And we're not talking about 11th hour interventions in grade 12 or even grade 11. We're probably talking about identifying students in middle school, because students start taking some of the A to G courses in middle school and helping them then. There's some rules of thumb we can already use. We know that students with low grade point average, English learners, students in special education are all students who need to be targeted. Our A to G OnTrack model takes all those things into account at the same time, along with some other variables like test scores, and tries to help districts forecast who really needs help. So the OnTrack model itself is calculated by running some Probit models, which are multivariate models trying to forecast who will complete the A to G requirements overall. And we did this using the class of 2011 data for San Diego Unified. And we used data from either grade 6 or grade 7. We started with grade 6, but one of our external reviewers pointed out that not all districts have access to good grade point average data for grade 6, because in many districts, grade 6 is still in the elementary schools. And elementary schools often calculate these things very differently. So we've done this with the grade 6 data. We've repeated it using grade 7 data, which for any district in California should be a middle school or a junior high school, where there's a well-formulated grade point average. We modeled the probability that students complete the A to G requirements with a C or higher, probability they complete with a D or higher, and also we ran models for each of the subject requirements: English language arts, math, social science, and so on. And we've published today on the PPIC website and also the Sandera website a set of spreadsheets that any district in the state can use. Essentially, the way they would use this would be to plug in their own data for students and to see how those students did. There are two different spreadsheets, two types of spreadsheets. One is called the validation spreadsheet, and the other is called the forecasting spreadsheet. The validation spreadsheet is something that any district apart from San Diego would need to start with. The reason we say that is that we can't know for certain that our models that we fit to San Diego data will work well in Oakland or San Jose or San Francisco. Different student populations, different course requirements for graduation, and so on. So in the validation spreadsheet, a district would take data for a class that's already graduated and put in data on grade 6 or grade 7 test scores, grades, things like that, along with data on whether the students actually graduated and whether they completed the A to G requirements. And then the spreadsheet calculates predictions and compares those predictions to what actually happened. And you should see a very strong positive relation between the forecast our model makes and what actually happened to those students. We've already done this for San Diego, and the model fits very well. If the model fits very well for another district, then it should feel free to use this model and to feel that they should have some confidence in its forecasting powers. Then they can use the forecasting spreadsheet, which is a simpler version of the validation spreadsheet. This is a version you use for students who've just completed grade 7. And you can use this to get forecasts of which subject areas in the A to G set of courses every single student will have trouble with. And so you can intervene early on, as early as grade 7 or 8, to help these students. So here's one example of one of the screens that you'll get as an output in the validation spreadsheet. Suppose that a district wants to use this tool and has some money set aside for, say, an after-school program or a summer school program, something like that, for struggling students. It could say, let's make a cutoff, say 0.3. What that means is, let's choose students who, according to this model, have a predicted probability of completing A to G of 0.3 or less. So if you do that, in San Diego, you would have found 1,461 students at the end of grade 6 who would be included in that intervention. The next question you'd want to know is, well, of that 1,461, how many would not have completed the A to G requirements with grades of D or higher without any intervention? So we're using actual data from graduates here. And the answer is about 48 or 49% of students who didn't complete A to G will be put into your intervention. So you're getting about half. You probably also want to know, as an administrator, how many students would I be putting into this intervention who would have gone on and completed A to G on their own without any help whatsoever. That's shown in this column. So 9.6, about 10% of students who completed A to G on their own will be put into the intervention. So that's one possibility. You might say, this isn't good enough. We want to help more than half the students who are not going to complete A to G. Suppose you pick a cutoff point of 0.6. So what that means is anybody who, according to the model, has a probability of below 60% of completing A to G will be put into the intervention. The cost of the program is going to double because the number of students rises from 1461 to 3108. But if you look at the middle row here, we're now getting 83.7% of the students that didn't complete A to G into the program, and we're getting about 40% or 42% of the students who would have completed A to G on their own. So that's sort of the gist of the model. And this is on the PPIC website and also on the Sandera website at UCSD. So let me just wrap up here with some policy implications, not just for San Diego, but for some of the other districts around the state as well. The first thing we think is really, really important is that districts develop multi-tiered communication strategies to make sure that every teacher, every parent, and every student knows about the new graduation requirement. We've heard anecdotal stories from other districts that are a bit further along than San Diego of parents and or students protesting that they had no idea about this new requirement. We don't want that to happen in the districts that have just implemented this, like San Diego and Los Angeles, so you're going to need to communicate with parents through every means you can imagine. Sending letters home, not just in English, but translated, using technology, and so on. We think that districts would be wise to invest in professional development for teachers. Teachers in these districts really are getting a double whammy. Right now, all of California is embroiled with the move to Common Core state standards, which is going to entail differences in what should be taught in every course. At the same time, that probably means that the course content of A to G courses will evolve as well. So we need professional development for those reasons alone. On top of it, we're going to be moving from a situation in San Diego where in a typical year, about 68, 69% of all high school students take all the A to G courses, to a situation where presumably 95 or 100% of students are going to be taking A to G courses. That implies if I'm a classroom teacher, I've now got a much more heterogeneous set of students in my A to G classroom than I did before. I have more students who are English learners, more students who are in special education, for example. So that really requires special training for teachers to help them differentiate their teaching to meet the needs of every single student in the classroom. There's a very big issue that district officials actually alerted us to, and that is that there are two separate parts of the state education code which make it really clear that a school district cannot have a single set of course requirements for a high school diploma. There's one part that says that you have to provide an alternative means to a high school diploma, presumably less academic means. Some districts explicitly have opt-out or alternative pathway processes right there on their website. Oakland has this already, and so does San Jose. We know that San Diego is working on that at this moment. There's a second part of the state education code which says that any student who completes grade 10 and who is in good standing has to be offered a choice between a regular academic track towards a high school diploma and a CTE, a career and technical education pathway to a high school diploma. San Diego has some excellent CTE courses and pathways in various high schools, and I think a real concern here is that those pathways don't get sort of pushed to the side. So San Diego is very aware of this as well, but it's something that we feel we need to bring up. It also raises a real issue. What do we mean when we say that all these districts have created A to G graduation requirements? Well, in the end, what it's probably going to be is one of several pathways. And I think what these districts are really trying to do is to create a new normal. This is going to be the new norm that typically students will complete A to G to get a high school diploma, but there will have to be other pathways, and districts really need to work on articulating what those pathways are going to be. What is the effect of these programs likely to be on overall enrollment of students from these districts in the University of California and Cal State? The whole motivation here for doing this is to expose more students to college prep coursework in the hope that some of them excel, get really good grades, and go to college when they wouldn't have even thought about doing that without these requirements. We think that in the long run, enrollment in the universities probably will rise from students coming from these districts. In the short run, though, it's very unclear for two reasons. The first is there are likely to be what we call negative peer effects. In other words, the average preparation of students in, say, an intermediate algebra math class in San Diego will probably be lower than it has been in the past, because now instead of 60, 70% of students taking these courses in high school, it's going to be virtually all. And that might have negative consequences, particularly in the short run, until teachers have mastered ways to handle more heterogeneous students in their classroom. The other issue is that we're going to have a greater percentage of teachers at the high school level teaching A to G classes than has been the case in the past. So this raises really important questions about whether the new teachers who are going to be brought in to teach these courses have the same sort of qualifications and ability to teach at this high level as the students who've been teaching these courses historically. You put those two things together, and these are sort of negative side effects, which could mean in the short run that it's logically possible that at CSU and UC enrollment could actually dip for a year or two until districts have actually figured out how to manage these possible negative side effects. That said, though, it seems that in the long run, it's likely that enrollment in Cal State and UC will probably rise from these districts. So just to recap, what we think are the most immediate concerns are shown on this slide. Number one, districts need to communicate really clearly and effectively, especially with parents and students, about the new requirements so that no one can say in grade 11 or 12, you didn't tell me about this. That's a disaster waiting to happen, and we need to prevent that. We really need to enhance professional development for teachers for all the reasons that I've mentioned. We have an urgent need to identify students who are at risk of not completing these new graduation requirements and intervene as early as possible, preferably in middle school. Our newly released A to G OnTrack model is one tool that we think can help districts to do that, and it will be used in San Diego. Two things we haven't mentioned I'm going to close with. To have a course count towards A to G requires a formal application by a district to the University of California. And the University of California will vet a course, look at the curriculum, and decide whether it qualifies or not. So we need to be very careful in all these districts that course content is not watered down when the students in the classroom become more heterogeneous with regard to initial achievement. And related to that, we need to be very watchful that this policy simply doesn't promote grade inflation. In other words, what used to be an F will now become a D. And that's something that all these districts need to be very careful about. So this report is available at the PPIC website, as well as the Sandera website, as well as the OnTrack model. We'd love to hear your questions. I'm going to ask Karen and Andy to come up and join me here because they can help me answer your questions.
On the slide where you were showing the effect on poverty and their income status, eligibility for.
So the question was, did you look at charter schools, and was there any difference between charter schools and traditional schools? So an issue in San Diego that I think is also an issue in other large districts is that most charter schools are startup schools. They weren't traditional public schools that were converted, and the district doesn't have transcript data for them. So we can't answer that. However, if you look at the technical appendix to this report, which is available online, we actually have a listing of high schools in the district, and the school that has the highest A to G completion rate with grades of C or higher is High Tech High, which is a charter school, and then the Pro School at UCSD, which is a charter school, I think has the second highest rate in the district. So those are two outperforming charter schools that are right at the top. But we haven't. What you really want to do here is to look at how well schools are doing, conditional upon the preparation of students when they arrive at that school, and that's something that we're not able to do because we don't have the course data. But that's a great question. We'd love to study it in detail. Yes, in the back.
One of the larger issues that comes into play.
Right. So the concern is more students will complete A to G. Maybe more students will go to UC and CSU. And we already see these alarming statistics at Cal State, for example, that a huge proportion of incoming freshmen fail the competency tests. So do one of you want to tackle that? Is that likely? There's a button right at the bottom here, I think you push.
Okay, thank you. The district currently receives information about the percentage of students by school who are required to take remedial coursework when they enter the university. We don't yet have access to those data, but we are investigating that because we agree with you that it would be a really strong and important indicator of the impact of the new graduation policy.
Thank you.
That's great. Yes?
I have a question regarding your Probit Model and particular narrative.
Right. So the question has to do with the Probit model. How do we handle in that multivariate analysis the problem of linearity between race and other things? Well, they're not 100% linear. If they're 100% linear, you actually couldn't estimate anything, and that's sort of the worst situation that you could get into. And they're not that strongly correlated so that we actually can estimate these things. However, when you look at the full-blown model that we showed you, where is that? Here. Trying to find it here. The Hispanic variable is still statistically significant. The others are not statistically significant, and they're actually fairly small. So if you look at the African American coefficients, they're around 3 or 4%. So they're very small, and it's suggesting that it's actually variation in GPA and test scores that's explaining the gap between African Americans and whites. But I think it is a real concern. So in the OnTrack model, what we decided to do was not to include race and ethnicity, partly due to concerns about linearity, partly because, with one exception, these things were not statistically significant, and partly because we don't think that districts are going to feel comfortable saying that, you know, these 2 students should be in remediation and these 3 students should not, and making decisions partly based on race and ethnicity. So our OnTrack model uses things like grade point average, test scores on the CST and math, English language arts, and the grade 5 science test, and absences.
Jump the rates.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a very pertinent question. How about there and then there?
Did you take a look at the number of Spanish-speaking English learners who take Spanish to meet their foreign language requirement?
I can't remember if we did that or not.
That took Spanish.
Yeah.
No, we did not.
I don't think we've done that. In an earlier report, we have looked at A to G completion in a different context, looking at some reading reforms that were put in place in San Diego. And I do remember a large number of students were satisfying their world language requirement by taking Spanish. So I think that's something you do see happening.
And the district does have classes that are Spanish for Spanish speakers.
Right.
And they have separate course codes. They meet the requirement just like any Spanish course would. So I think it's something we could investigate.
Yeah, we certainly could.
Yeah, so actually on a related note to that question, we noted in our report that a lot of students were struggling to complete the foreign language requirement, and one of the policies currently at the district is that they did not, at least for the class of 2011, require that students complete the foreign language requirement. So that's part of the explanation for why students were behind in that particular category.
And I think, lady, right behind you had a question too.
When of the 12% that didn't complete the A to G, 7% you said went to UC or CSU.
Yep.
Was the other 5% just out of state, or could they have also gone to California?
Um,
Another university in California?
They went out of state. I think the top one was Northern Arizona University, if I remember. Do you remember? If you look at the technical appendix, which you can download online, we've got a rank ordering of every single post-secondary institution. And community colleges dominate the top 10, along with San Diego State and UCSD.
She was asking about the.
But in
the
terms
ones that
of
did not
out of
complete-
state, right.
Or they did not complete UCA.
Oh, for the ones who did not complete,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's probably not in the table in technical appendix, is it?
No, it's not. So I did take a look at the 7.9% of students that did not complete UC A to G, but did end up at a 4-year institution. And the vast number of those students ended up going to San Diego State, and we think that's due to waivers. Although, interestingly enough, I did find 19 students did not complete UC A to G and ended up at Cal. But these were highly qualified students. I looked at them. They have an average 3.8 out of 4.0 GPA, high test score.
They're the ones taking community college courses in
Most
summer.
likely, yeah.
And I think it was 40, now I remember, you calculate 40% of these students who ended up anyway at UC or Cal State were at San Diego State. Yeah.
You mentioned the community college.
I know that there's a formal data agreement between San Diego Unified and the local community college system, but I'm not sure why. You probably know the history of this better than I do, Karen.
The district has a partnership with a number of community colleges, and students go to the community college and they take community college level coursework. So this is not high school coursework they're taking, it's community college coursework. On the San Diego Unified transcripts, I believe it's in the education code that the only thing that can go on that transcript is coursework taken in a district. So because if the district doesn't, quote, own that course, it can't certify that the student took a course that met graduation requirements. There are data kept separate from the district's data system so that people know at the school level which students have met which requirements through alternative means, but it's not a part of the district's data system, so it can't be tracked at this point.
So district officials are pretty concerned about this for reasons you can imagine, and are going to work over the next 3 years to make sure that even though it doesn't show up on the transcripts, that they're aware of these courses so the students can get their high school diploma on time.
Independent study schools put community college transcript data on their high school graduation transcripts so that the kids can make the decision
Right.
to community college. I just wondered if that might be a policy point that needs to be cleaned up.
And it's the state education code, you think?
I believe it, and the district is aware of this and is working toward trying to figure out a workaround. When students who take community college coursework apply to the UC or CSU, they then have to submit 2 transcripts. They submit their high school transcript and a transcript from the community college, and that transcript is evaluated by the admissions committees at the CSU and UC. But you're correct, it doesn't appear on the high school transcript.
We're waiting a long time, I'm sorry.
Potentially the same thing.
Okay, so I have a very small memory bank, so you can probably have to ask some of these questions again. But let me try to work through these. So the first was you felt that 60%, our result that 60% were completing A to G with grades of D or higher was pretty high, but the 32% figure going to college was small. The 32% going to college was of all graduates. So here's the actual data. So you'll see that if you look at the leftmost column, 29.4% of graduates had no post-secondary record in the year after graduating. So I mean 71% actually did go somewhere. 32% went to a 4-year college or university, and 37.9% went to a 2-year college. So we don't think those numbers are low. So I think maybe either I misspoke or you misheard. I think what you wanted to know was this. Of graduates completing UC A to G, what fraction actually went to a 4-year university? That number is pretty high. It's 60.6%. So students who complete, more than half of them are going, and that compares to just 12% of those who graduated but did not complete A to G with grades of C or higher. So the 60%, I didn't know the number was going to be that high, the 60% completing A to G with grades of D or higher. And going from 60% to 100%, that's going to be very difficult. But there are 2 things we need to bear in mind. One is that we can get from 60% to 80% of graduates completing simply by having each student take 2 or 3 more A to G courses before the end of grade 12. And I think that's doable. So getting up to 80%, I think, is feasible. The other thing that I think is very clear is that San Diego will shortly articulate 1 or more alternative pathways. So what we might end up with by 2016 or by 2020 is maybe 85% of students graduating, meeting these requirements, and maybe another 15% or 20% graduating using an alternative pathway, most likely involving career and technical education. Now, actually, I haven't forgotten your second question. I wish I had. But the second question was about an LA Times story about actually 2 stories, a story and then an editorial about San Jose Unified. So San Jose Unified was the first to adopt this program, and a former superintendent at the time had made a great deal out of the fact that the graduation rate had not fallen, which was a concern because we're concerned about people dropping out. And the grades had not fallen, and most students were completing the A to G requirements. And the data that San Jose was sending to the state and put on the CD website showed a massive, almost instantaneous increase in the proportion completing A to G from something like 40% to 60%, which persisted for several years. It's now been acknowledged in 2 research studies, as well as the LA Times article, that those data were not correct, and we're not sure what the problem was. So I can show you. This is a graph from the report. I think it's the final or second to last figure in your report. Here's an updated figure that corrects 1 data point for LA and adds 1 more year, and also adds in San Jose. So San Jose is the red line here, and they implemented in 2002, and I just don't want to show you these results because it's been widely acknowledged that those numbers were not correct. They were listed as somewhere around 60%. What you see happening in San Jose is that really they've gone from about somewhere between 38 to 40% completion rate the year before this reform to a little bit above 40% now. So there's been a slight improvement over time. The orange bars here are the statewide trends, and you'll see there's been a slight improvement over time statewide. So it's not clear that San Jose has really been preparing more people to be competitively eligible to attend Cal State and CSU. Of course, in the defense of San Jose, they weren't requiring letter grades of C, and that's what we're showing here. This is the only A to G information that districts are required to send to the state. And then I think the second part of your question was, well, given the well-acknowledged problems with the data from San Jose, can you trust the data from San Diego? Well, think of what we're doing as sort of an arm's length calculation. We have access to essentially the administrative records, which are provided to us, and we did all these calculations on our own. We come within 3 percentage points of what the district calculated for the class of 2011. So we're pretty sure that in a typical year what San Diego is sending to the CDE is accurate, and we feel very confident in our own calculations because Andy literally looked at every single course offered in San Diego Unified.
Not by paper.
Not by paper. But I think you need, another way of asking your question is, how much can we trust data on A to G on the state website? And I think the data are very noisy. If you look at LA Unified, you see, that's the green line. You see these numbers going up and down and up and down. There's a Harvard group that recently published sort of an on-track examination of LA Unified and came up with, for this year, an estimate of, I think, 27%, whereas the district's report is right now 34%. And their initial data, which is unfortunately in our report, showed something like, let me just see. It reported as 75% for 2011. It's now been corrected down to 34%. So the district on the state website is very noisy, and you need to be very careful. That's why I think the best way to do this is by working individually with districts and really getting to know the people who gather the data and working with the data yourself. Well, that was a 15-minute answer to set of very difficult questions. Yeah. 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 I don't know of any districts here that are doing that, but we just learned last week that another district in San Diego County, Carlsbad, is adopting this, as has Sweetwater. So it could be there are a number of districts that have started to do this, and it's quite possible that we're unaware of some of these things being done. But you can really see that the ACLU had a major impact here because the districts they talked to were really large urban ones like San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, San Diego. It could be that smaller districts elsewhere in the state are going to start to adopt this as well. So if you know of any, please let us know because we'd like to stay up to date. So other questions? Right. Yes.
Does your data report discuss the costs
Right. So what are the costs? That's pretty hard to figure out in the sense that we're convinced that if you really want to get 80–90% of students meeting this requirement, it's going to require all sorts of things like summer school, which the district has already voted to do, to expand summer school. I haven't seen any cost calculations for that. And I think you're probably also getting at the question of regular staffing during the school year. And I'm not sure what the implications there might be there. Do you have thoughts on that, Karen?
We don't think it's going to cost any more to implement A to G with staffing taken into consideration, because San Diego Unified graduation requirements are very similar to the UC requirements. San Diego does not at this time require 2 years of world language, and they require 3 years of mathematics, but there's one mathematics course, intermediate algebra, that they do not require. So there are really only 3 courses that are different than the UC requirements currently, and the San Diego requirements are quite a bit higher than many other districts across the state. So given that funding for schools is based on the number of students enrolled, the district will just need to reallocate so that they have the number of courses needed to help all students meet the requirements. The greater concern, as Julian touched on earlier, might be finding enough teachers who are adequately credentialed, especially to teach world language, because that hasn't been a requirement in the past. So if all of a sudden you have an entire cohort of students coming through that needs world language where that didn't happen before, that could cause quite a bit of challenge to the district.
Any other questions? Yeah, well, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon, and we've been writing down your questions, and they're going to give us some ideas for future work, I hope. Thank you very much for attending.